Our next speaker is Gabriele, who is an UNRISD Senior Research Associate and also member of the Governing Board of Women in Europe for a Common Future, as well as being an author of an article in the special issue of the journal. She is going to be talking today about how we can connect the gender dimensions of this new agenda, the SDGs, with international political platforms like Beijing or Cairo. Thank you, Gabriele.
Thank you, Moira, and thank you everyone for coming. To me, the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs are about two things. They're about gender equity, and they're also about climate justice. And those two factors are completely interrelated, because as we know, women and girls are the people who suffer the most from climate change impact, and at the same time are probably the group that can be the most transformative. Now, as probably most of you know, this 2030 Agenda is cast as a transformative agenda for change. It was, in terms of its process, quite transformative because there was a different way of negotiating the text, lots of very deep and severe discussions, and what we have in this 2030 Agenda is probably much better than anything people were hoping for, most notably the fact that it was possible to bring the strand of MDGs together with the strand of the Rio discussions and to really unite the climate change and the social economic development agenda. So on the content side, I think we have a very good piece, and on the process side, we have a very good piece because the content, because the process was a meaningful one, the content is also very useful. At the same time, having said that, is it really transformative? Is it good for women? Will it be useful for our agendas as gender-sensitive people? And there is where the caveats start coming in. First of all, in bringing climate and gender justice together. Valeria has already pointed out some of the contradictions in the text, growth orientation, which does not really tally very well with the planetary boundaries that we're facing. Some of the objectives are contradictory in themselves and not very clear, but my main reservation, my message today is that where we need to do much more work on the 2030 Agenda is at the policy level. Because there are strewn throughout the text, there are different recommendations of what needs to happen in terms of decent work, in terms of social protection, in terms of looking at and valorizing care chains, but it's not really very exact on what would need to happen. And I think the UN system has been shying away in recent decades, and the intergovernmental process has been careful to not be too invasive because countries are playing in policy space. But what that has meant is that the UN isn't really saying anything anymore on what kind of policies would indeed be needed if one wanted to transform. And so there's a lot of attention paid to the global inequities. To me, the most important SDG is actually the one on overcoming inequalities within and across countries, because that also subsumes all the other dimensions of gender inequity where they coincide and coalesce with other forms of social and economic discrimination and exclusion. But so the UN system and the intergovernmental process is not really very exact, very precise, very informative on what kind of steps would actually need to be taken. So what I did in the article was look through all of the chapters, obviously, of the text itself, and one can milk it, one can harvest it for different policy recommendations, but they're quite scattered and they don't really cohere into saying, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, this is what needs to happen if climate justice and gender justice is to happen by 2030, which is a very long time. We're leaving ourselves in that process. So I felt one needs to look what else is out there, what other kinds of resources, what kinds of references exist, and going all the way back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was actually much more exact, and as Valeria was pointing out, it speaks of the right to education, the right to health, the right to well-being, even the right to social security, so it's much more exact on what, at that point in time, in the 1940s, the international community was promising to strive for. So that's the first point of reference. Then, of course, there are all the very important conventions, the Convention on the Eradication of Discrimination Against Women, the Child Rights Convention, the Convention on People with Disabilities, the Convention on ethnically excluded groups. Each of those has recommendations which are relevant to women. But then I remember, being an older person in the room, I remember the Cairo conference, which actually produced the action plan for population and development. And lo and behold, in 1994, over 20 years ago, one was actually speaking of sustainable consumption and production. One was speaking of gender equity, of climate justice, and it was a much more precise, spelt out in bullet points, as it were, policy recommendations on the importance of decent work, the importance of reconciling care responsibilities with work, formal sector paid work responsibilities, of reconciling sustainability issues, looking at, they didn't say carbonization in those days, but looking at how one can have employment-rich but resource-poor economic development. So my point in the article, and that I'd like to convey and discuss with all of you, is that we can use the 2030 agenda, the UN Development Agenda, for the next 15 years, but we need to combine it with other packages of norms and rights and declarations and conventions to actually make the most of it, and to do what I call be a bit subversive and say, well, actually, it's not just about empowerment, it is really about totally equal rights of women and men. It's about totally equal rights of children and their rights to live to their full potential. It's about social inclusion, and it is about the planetary boundaries. And all of these goals will be much more difficult to achieve if we say in high GDP types of economies, growth has to be revisited. We need to go into a post-growth kind of mode, which will be very painful for those of us living on the northern half of the planet, and for some of the people, the elites living in the southern half of the planet. But without doing that, we will not really achieve social, economic, gender, and climate justice. What I think is one way of framing it is to use paradigms that exist in different literatures around what are the different policy areas that need to be addressed, everything from the gender equality, obviously, but through knowledge and sense of education, health, access to health services. The care economy was mentioned by Valeria. The time dimensions, time budget dimensions, but very importantly, power relations within families, within households, within communities, and within countries and between countries. So to close, this first round of discussion, use the transformative remit of the Sustainable Development Goal Agenda, but supplement it with other more rights-based kind of conventions that also exist and that all countries have committed, or almost all countries have committed to. Bring in the whole dimension of planetary boundaries, and then sort of put the whole agenda on its head in a certain way, reverse the hierarchy, as UNRISD likes to say, and say that the social and the gender and the climate justice criteria and principles are what should lead all economic and other decisions. Thank you very much.